Hello. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to our first event of the spring semester. My name is Sam Skimmerhorn, and I am a second-year member of Markets and Morality. On behalf of our co-sponsors, including the Tocqueville Forum, the Political Science Department, and the Center for Diversity and Inclusion, we thank both our in-person and online guests today. This evening's lecture will be one to remember. As a member of Markets and Morality, I have learned to appreciate and enjoy discussing a wide range of economic, political, and social issues about which reasonable people can disagree and which can impact individuals differently. Through our various readings, events, and travel, hopefully soon, we're able to dive deep into discussions about how economic systems influence human flourishing, and we're especially committed to do so using our Christian values. This year, Markets and Morality is focusing on intellectual empathy and its importance in our diverse culture. While we are all experiencing increased tensions, it is refreshing to discuss the issues that require deep thinking with students that are curious and committed to learn. Like our friends at the Tocqueville Forum, M&M is an extracurricular activity that provides so much more than something on a resume. It challenges students to think in ways that are so much bigger than ourselves. If you have any questions about Markets and Morality or are interested in joining, please see us in the table in the back after the lecture or email us at marketsandmorality@hope.edu. Before I invite Dr. Paulette to introduce our speaker, I would like to make one logistical announcement to both our in-person and online guests today. Following Dr. Ferguson's lecture, there will be time for Q&A. We would love for you to submit questions, and you can do so using slido.com. That is slido.com. Once you arrive there, you can enter the code LIBERATION. And then also you can upvote questions submitted there too. Once again, that is www.slido.com with the code LIBERATION. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Professor Paulette from the Political Science Department and the Tocqueville Forum to introduce our speaker, Dr. Rachel Ferguson. Thank you.
All right, well, welcome everyone. Nice to see so many of you here tonight. As Abby said, this is put together mainly by Markets and Morality and the Tocqueville Forum. You can tell which one Dr. Estelle is running because it's highly organized. There's a table available with stuff on it, and they've got a cool and catchy nickname, M&M. TF doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, and I've got no free gifts or swag for anyone. But what we do is the Tocqueville Forum, we have meetings where we read books together and discuss books. In addition to that, host lectures such as this one. Abby mentioned the Political Science Department, the Philosophy Department, and the Center for Diversity and Inclusion as co-sponsors of this event, and I'd like to express my gratitude to them. And I'd especially like to express my gratitude to the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. Elizabeth Newman at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute is a Hope grad, and she's done great work helping set up events like this. We have a couple other events coming up this semester that I might want to draw your attention to. On March 16th in the Miller Auditorium, we're going to be along with the Russell Kirk Center, we'll be hosting a conversation with Ian Rowe of the American Enterprise Institute and John Wood Jr. of Braver Angels about the future of race in America. That will be 7 p.m. In the Miller Center Auditorium. On April 7th, we have Dr. Mark Hall from George Fox University coming to speak on Christian nationalism. And on March 14th, we have Dr. David Corey of Baylor University speaking on liberty or liberation, the purpose of higher education. So you might want to mark your calendars. Those should all be interesting events as well. One last thing about the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, our main sponsor for the evening. They do have other events that they sponsor, and one of the main things they do is put together weekend and week-long conferences. So Dr. Ferguson and I were both faculty members at the week-long honors conference last summer. Where were we? In Williamsburg, that's right. We were in Williamsburg, Virginia, staying for a week at a very nice resort, and the students heard a lot of interesting lectures, including the one you're about to hear tonight. There is a regional conference coming up in Indianapolis the first weekend of April. I know a few of you have already signed up to attend that conference. Land of Hope, the Roots of American Order is the name of the conference. We'll be staying. ISI pays all your expenses for these weekends or for these, yeah, it's a great deal for these conferences. So if you have any interest in that, please come see me or email me, and I can give you more information about those things. All right. Let me introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Rachel Ferguson, a professor at Concordia University in Chicago. She's the Assistant Dean of the College of Business and the Director of the Free Enterprise Center there. Her research interests include David Hume's classical liberalism, the philosophy of economics, and Aristotelian virtue theory. And like a good Humean, she likes to appeal to and tick off both sides of an argument. I should also point out, by the way, that she's living evidence that there will be no good order on college campuses until either philosophers become deans or deans become philosophers. Yeah, the students can't appreciate how funny that is, yeah. She received her PhD in philosophy from St. Louis University. In the meantime, she had two babies, Asher and Solomon, who now, she says, appear to be sentient persons, although they're teenagers, so it's in question. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ferguson.
That was entertaining. You guys got to see some inside academic jokes there. You won't get it until you become an academic. But anyway, I'm so honored to be here. This is just wonderful. Thank you to Dr. Estelle and Dr. Paulette for bringing me, and the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. Is Stephen Smith here? Ah, yes. And I got to meet Stephen Smith just last week for the first time, so this is really exciting to be on Hope's campus. I wanted to get a little read of the room real fast. So are we like a lot of econ students? Students from econ classes? How many? Oh, like it's like this side and back there. Okay, so on purpose, I'm including a lot of econ content here, so you can dive in there. And then also, Hope is a Christian college, right? This is a personal question, so don't answer me if you don't want to. For how many of you was it being a Christian college, was that like part of your decision in coming here? Did you say? Okay, yeah. Pretty good cohort there. All right, and I'm at a Christian college for the first time in my life. I worked for 16 years at a college that was just secular, and I'm now at a Lutheran college, and I am a Christian, so this is very exciting for me, kind of diving into the waters of bringing the element of faith into these conversations, and I'm going to do that today as well, so we're going to talk about economics and faith, and they interact more than you'd think. So I'm going to make my case. Okay. All right, so we're going to look at both of these topics in the context of Black American history. I am publishing a book in May called Black Liberation Through the Marketplace, Hope, Heartbreak, and the Promise of America. And it's a look at Black American history through a classical liberal lens. So it's just a contribution to the conversation. It's not the end of the conversation by any means. But I think that classical liberals have more to say on race and discrimination than we often think. Now you may be thinking, what the heck is a classical liberal? Well, don't worry, you're about to find out. It's a very important tradition in the United States. Certainly one very important to people like Frederick Douglass, and other important Black thinkers like Zora Neale Hurston, for instance. And so it's an important contribution that I think we should consider. So I'm going to go over some of those insights today. So mainstream economics kind of takes this thing, the market, as a sort of baseline, right? And this is a situation in which prices are a good indicator of supply and demand, and that allows people to make efficient choices in their economic calculations. You guys in econ are kind of following what I'm saying, right? You know, supply and demand. We even learned that kind of basic stuff in 8th grade economics, right? And so once we've got this basic concept in place, then we can analyze when and why things go wrong, you know, causing shortages or avoidable losses, or sometimes in really bad circumstances, even poverty. But this market assumes a lot of things. It assumes a legal background in which people are treated as though they own themselves. Or maybe we Christians would say we steward ourselves. God's our maker, so he owns us, but we are our own stewards, right? We're in charge of ourselves. It assumes that we own our labor and can trade our labor freely for other things. It assumes that we own those things and can trade them. These are called property rights, freedom of contract. Furthermore, if our bodily integrity, our property, or our contracts are violated, it assumes equal protection of the rule of law. Finally, a successful economic marketplace must also cultivate a culture that appreciates the role of the business person and the entrepreneur. That's actually sometimes like a forgotten ingredient, because in many cultures, the merchant or the tradesperson is not necessarily a respectable job, right? So that's a culture change that has to occur. We have to sort of see what the good they're doing for us. And the reliability of the system of defending all of these rights, let's call this the justice system, along with a culture of appreciation for business, is what inspires a people to learn and innovate and cooperate and build a thriving economy. High trust societies do very well with development, and societies that struggle with trust have trouble with economic development. And the free market assumes one more thing, which is really many things, and this is the existence of civil society. Civil society is the term we use for the collection of voluntary associations we form that are not about buying and selling. So the state isn't voluntary, that's coercion, right? Maybe necessary, but it's coercion. The market is voluntary, but it's about buying and selling. But neither of those things are really the center of our lives, right? The center of our lives is civil society. Things like churches, nonprofits, Alcoholics Anonymous, sporting leagues, fraternal associations, your book club, even just your friendships are all examples of civil society. So it's a kind of umbrella term. A free market needs a robust civil society to create the networks, the culture, and the values that will sustain a flourishing economy. Now, if we start at the beginning of the Black American experience, we see a population of people that is denied every single aspect of what I just described, every single one. They are not treated as though they own themselves or their own labor. They are not allowed to move around freely and make contracts, not even marriage contracts. Think about that. Not even official legal marriage contracts. They are not protected in their rights by the justice system. In many states under the slave system, even free blacks were forbidden from owning property. In 1796, St. George Tucker, a lawyer and future district court judge, suggested a system in which no black person, free or slave, be allowed to own any lands or buildings so that the black seeds of ambition would be buried too deep ever to germinate. And those sorts of laws were picked up in several states. The slave system even compromised the legal rights that it had granted to slaveholders by making it illegal to free one's own slaves, or by making freed slaves leave the state, because the mere presence of free black people threatened the system of racialized slavery. In the small gardens that some enslaved people were allowed to cultivate for their own use, we see how the incentives change when something belongs to us. After a harrowing day's work, the owners of these little gardens would sleep a few hours and then get back up to garden by the light of the moon. They were sometimes allowed to sell these vegetables in the market or back to the plantation. Their productivity in their own gardens was so obviously superior that some of the agricultural magazines at the time toyed with the idea of instituting some sort of cash incentive system. But of course, such an idea was much too close to wage labor for the planters to give it a try. So we see sort of how economic incentives and disincentives are at play here. Now, sometimes, and this is becoming increasingly popular, I've noticed, sometimes slavery is depicted as though it's a great boon to white people, or that it was of a great economic benefit in general. And this is one where we have to be very sort of careful in the way we explain it, because it's absolutely true that slaveholders benefited very much financially. They got very rich. and the South had a pretty large economy. But they became rich in the manner of pirates. A pirate becomes rich by transferring through violence the wealth that another person has created and transfers it to himself. So we all know that pirates can get rich through their theft, but no one wants to live in a society of pirates. Pirates are not productive. They don't make anything new. They don't expand the economy in any way. You see what I'm saying? They're moving things around, but they're not innovating. They're not expanding. In fact, they undermine the economy by undermining the confidence of productive tradespeople, right? Because if people are afraid of crime, then they're more risk averse, right? They're less likely to take risks in trade. Similarly, slavery made some people very rich, but a slave economy can never compare to a free labor economy. Slaveholders themselves made no greater profit margins than Northern industrialists, but if black people were free, they could build their human capital by learning, move to wherever their labor was most needed, innovate and cooperate with others to bring better and cheaper goods to market. In a market economy, we not only make ourselves richer in these ways, but we also enrich those around us. We grow the pie, right? Grow the pie. The slave system not only crushed the economic well-being of the enslaved themselves, but also bid down white wages because they had to compete with slave labor. So it's one thing to be a white slave holder, it's another thing to be just a white Southern worker, right, under the slave system who's competing with slave labor and trying to make a decent wage. It also discouraged innovation and the building of infrastructure, making the South more technologically backwards than necessary. We actually saw the South using manual labor for jobs that were being done by steam engines like 50 years prior. And they were still using very inefficient forms of labor. The South was worse off than it would have been without slavery. And white people who weren't slaveholders were also economically worse off than they would have been if everyone had been free. So that's the comparison I'm making, right, between the South as a slave society and the South as a free society. The way that we talk as economists can sound cold-hearted and amoral, as though all we care about is per capita GDP. But what we're noticing is the connection that we see in a free society between human economic flourishing and respect for the freedom and rights of every single individual. Unlike many enslaved people throughout history and around the world, many black Americans believed that their enslavement was not only absolutely unjust, but also that the slave system harmed the white population, including even slaveholders who gained materially but lost their souls. When compared with other enslaved people around the world, why did enslaved black people in America develop such a high view of themselves, their rights, and the benefits of freedom? And I'm going to argue that it's because of the black church. According to the late, great Albert Rabateau, he actually just passed away a few months ago, author of the classic Slave Religion, very, very highly respected expert. Most Southern slaveholders were nominal Anglicans who were afraid that if the enslaved among them converted to Christianity, they would actually have a legitimate claim to freedom as brothers and sisters in Christ. They were fairly unchurched themselves also. People were quite scattered, the population. So those slaveholders really did not evangelize. Instead, enslaved black Americans converted in large numbers during the evangelical Great Awakening movements. Many were converted at the famous tent meetings, but many more were converted when the original converts came back to the plantation and gave them the good news that their sins could be forgiven by a God who loved them so much, he had suffered and died for them. But black Christians were uniquely struck by a part of the scriptures not as heavily emphasized by the revival preachers. First, Genesis 1. They were ecstatic to find that every single person, including themselves, of course, were made in the very image of God. That meant that all human beings are siblings that they are of equal, that is, infinite value, and they shared in the dignity of bearing God's image. They also identified especially with the Exodus story, in which the children of Israel were freed by God from oppressive slavery. They paid far more attention than white American Christians to the prophetic parts of the Bible, like the book of Amos, in which the moral priority of the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger is made abundantly clear to the Hebrew people. In fact, these were the exact passages removed from the famous slave Bible. I don't know if you've heard of this, but this was a Bible that enslaved people were allowed to have by their slaveholders, but much of the content of the Bible was redacted, including the entire book of Exodus except the Ten Commandments, and much of the prophets were just taken right out. Anything that might lead to the idea of being free. And they loved Jesus. They sung spirituals about how much he understood their experience of being unjustly rejected. Planters' fears that their converted slaves would interpret Christianity as implying their own equality and freedom were well-founded. Raboteau famously describes the black church as the invisible institution because the heart of black Christian spirituality had to develop in secret. No matter how independent the black church, open meetings were always subject to white scrutiny. Many masters disallowed black believers from going to church at all. Some were disallowed from prayer itself. Those who were allowed to go were subject to something called the rule of gospel order in every sermon, meaning that preachers only talked to them about obedience to masters and prohibitions on stealing or lying. One interviewed former slave complained that he said nothing about Jesus was ever said, and the overseer stood there to see the preacher talk as he wanted him to talk. Instead, slaves met at secretly appointed times in places called hush harbors, hiding their prayers, preaching and singing in various ways, such as gathering on their knees in a circle over a pot full of water to drown out sound so they wouldn't be found out. And they absolutely prayed just as the slaveholders feared. They prayed for deliverance from bondage and with assurance that they too, like the children of Israel, would someday be free. Many suffered terribly for their insistence on this corporate worship, flogged and beaten if they were found out. The reality of this invisible institution is borne out by the numbers. Frederick Douglass reported 468,000 official black church members in 1859. 45 years later, that number had jumped to 2.7 million. Those who came south to evangelize the ex-slaves found many of them already deeply engaged in the faith and even the finer points of doctrine and Christian practice. Raboteau compellingly argues that I'm quoting him here, the extent to which the Christianity of American slaves was hindered, proscribed, and persecuted justifies applying the title confessor and martyr to those slaves who, like their ancient Christian predecessors, bore witness to the Christian gospel despite the threat of punishment and even death at the hand not of pagans, but of fellow Christians. To those Christian faithful among the slaves, the contradiction of a slaveholding Christianity was not simply a lamentable circumstance for themselves, but also nothing short of heresy. Since the slaves converted under and maintained a radical evangelical Christianity distinct from the religion of their slaveholders, they often stood in judgment of their slaveholders' gospel as false and of their faith as heretical. They saw themselves as true followers of the faith. They even believed that God had, quote, selected them for some mysterious purpose to demonstrate in one people the full maturation of Christianity. After emancipation, the black church became a haven where black leadership, black manhood and womanhood, and the black mind was acknowledged and respected. It also became what the great researchers on the black church, Lincoln and Mamiya, call the cultural womb of black America. The black church quickly became the most well-developed institution, making it a nexus of all black cultural life. Just like all Protestants, black Protestants wanted to read the Bible, so the literacy campaign began. Free Black Mary Peake worked tirelessly to educate the children of formerly enslaved people. After Mary's untimely death in 1862, missionary groups carried on her efforts, and Hampton Institute launched in 1867. It churned out 1,000 teachers over the next 25 years. Hampton Institute would shape the literacy movement across the black community in the South that resulted in an almost completely unlettered population reaching a literate majority by 1910. Higgs calls the achievement, and Higgs is an economic historian, he calls the achievement of so much in such a short amount of time and with so few resources an accomplishment seldom witnessed in human history. The black elite that arose from this movement in Hampton, Virginia, were so sophisticated and cosmopolitan that it made little sense to their white neighbors that such people should be subjugated. Due to the influence of Hampton, many black leaders fought hard toward the specific goal of obtaining property in order to run successful businesses and become economically independent. By the end of the 19th century, Virginia property holdings by black Americans far exceeded the average for black people throughout the country because of Hampton. Booker T. Washington went to Hampton. As leaders like Booker T. Washington spread out to other great black institutions like the Tuskegee Institute, they took this philosophy of economic freedom with them, forming a black elite who became the most prominent drivers of movements for equal rights and economic uplift. So I will loop back to this story at the end of the talk when we get to the civil rights movement. And the same can be, I won't go into detail, but there were also these freedmen's towns all over the South, incredible growth in black land ownership by 1900, 75 officially established freedmen's towns, and many others that were unofficial. So as black Americans developed themselves, living out their vision of themselves as image bearers of God, at the same time, their white neighbors were moving in the opposite direction. And I wanted to choose a couple of examples here. There's a lot we could say between emancipation and civil rights. But I wanted to pick a couple of things that you may not have heard of before. I've noticed as I've gone around to audiences that they're not necessarily aware. So, for instance, have you heard of the Convict Leasing program? I'm getting a few nods. Okay, so maybe 5 or 6 of you have heard of the Convict Leasing program. It's incredible in a way that we don't know more about it. Lynching, we know a lot about lynching. Lynching was psychological terrorism, which is one of the reasons why it looms so large in our imagination. But in terms of the numbers of people who were murdered, it's actually the Convict Leasing program that is more prominent. Immediately upon taking back power, white Democratic Redeemer governments began to find ways to reestablish white supremacy and dominance in the South. Local and state officials had to be strategic, using creative new laws to ensure black Southerners remained in an inferior social and economic condition. Some of the measures adopted included vagrancy laws, pig laws, and even laws banning black men from switching employment. The pig laws, which were passed in Alabama, Georgia, Florida, and Mississippi, converted previous misdemeanor offenses into felony offenses. For example, stealing a pig worth $1 could result in a felony charge and 5 years in prison. Tennessee's laws were so harsh that if someone stole an 8-cent fence post, they could find themselves sentenced to hard labor. Vagrancy laws were the most common, and they were purposefully vague. The result was that virtually any freed slave not under the protection of a white man could be arrested for the crime. White law enforcement would routinely stop and ask black men and a few black women for proof of employment. If the person being questioned could not prove employment, they would be arrested and become a criminal. Once these black men were convicted, state and local governments had to figure out what to do with them. The widespread criminalization of black life meant that caring for these criminals, right, many of whom were not criminals at all, they were just standing there, could quickly burden the state and local authorities. By 1877, all the southern states, with the exception of Virginia, adopted a system of leasing convicts to private entities as a way to profit from the convicts' labor without being forced to care for them. How was this possible? After all, the 13th Amendment had guaranteed an end to slavery. But the amendment came with a qualifier: neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. Shall exist within the United States. So local and state officials made black men and a few poor whites criminals by making new laws and selectively enforcing them against the people they wanted to control. The term convict leasing makes it seem like this episode in our history is simply about making imprisoned criminals work. But this gravely misunderstands what happened in the years after the Civil War, and even as late as the 1950s. The leasing of men for labor on farms and in industry was only nominally the leasing of convicts. That's because a significant number, quite possibly the bulk of the men arrested, charged and sent to work were not criminals at all. And I highly recommend the book Slavery by Another Name by Douglas Blackman, The Re-Enslavement of Black Americans from the Civil War to World War II. He explains really well how perfectly innocent people were caught up in a web of what we can only properly refer to as an underground slave market. That's really all it was. This market served some large farms, but also the burgeoning southern industries of coal and steel. The states realized that they could improve their budgets by collecting on any convicts they delivered as laborers, and a group of conspirators in small towns, including a justice of the peace and a few of his trusted friends, realized that they could personally enrich themselves by doing so as well. In a legal environment in which black men were close to completely helpless, these supposed lawmen arrested them for the following reasons: carrying a weapon, almost all men did so at the time, but it was only illegal for black men; riding on empty freight train cars, speaking loudly in front of a white woman, vagrancy, as we said before; changing employers without permission; voting illegally; using obscene language; selling whiskey; selling cotton after sunset; many other trivial and innocent activities. And frankly, sometimes there was nothing listed as a conviction. When the demand for laborers went up, these already trivial accusations could simply be made spuriously against any black man at hand with the help of a white witness who was paid for his services. In a survey of the scant records we retain, many prisoners simply have the phrase "not listed" in the column where the charges should go. In one 1898 board report, the not listed group was in the majority. The trial was often conducted in a matter of a few minutes, with exorbitant court fees added to the fine that the justice of the peace meted out. This was the real trick. Once the criminal owed some amount surpassing several months' wages, a white man could pay his fine for him, with the understanding that the black man could pay off his debt by working at the farm or in the mines for no less than a year. While there, the man would be charged for supplies or medical treatment and forced to stay longer to pay his newly acquired debts. So it was a trap. One of the terrible ironies of this practice, and think about incentives here again, is that overseers ran the work gangs with the attitude of slavers, but no one legally owned them, these people, as slaves. These men believed that African Americans under the lash were the key to building an industrial sector in the South. That meant that the convicts were treated far, far worse than anything they had endured on the plantation, where at the very least their owners limited their own cruelty to protect their investment. As terrible as that sounds, right? It's even worse in the case of convict leasing. Sheriffs were allowed to keep any extra money from the food allotment, creating a perverse incentive to feed the laborers as little as possible. Working from 3 a.m. to 8 p.m., they rarely saw the light of day. The men were whipped mercilessly, water-tortured, kept in filthy, vermin-infested, unventilated quarters, and left for dead when waves of sickness swept through the camps. Without any personal incentive to take care of the men and with fresh laborers easily available, overseers treated these unjustly imprisoned black men as entirely expendable. And I won't go into all the numbers, but it literally climbed to, at one point in 1879, 40% of the camp just died from plague. The sickness swept through because everyone was so totally physically compromised by the situation. And the scale of this was huge. It really cannot be exaggerated. Hundreds of thousands of black men went through this system of convict leasing. There's another way, kind of following this, the rise of convict leasing, that we see that concept of the imago Dei, the image of God, being denied by the larger culture around black Americans and around black Christians. As the 20th century came to a close, new philosophies arose that no longer even needed an invented crime as an excuse to disrespect the humanity of black Americans. And I'm talking here about social Darwinism. With the rise of progressivism, and this I'm using the term technically here, the progressive movement, capital P. With the rise of the progressive movement at the turn of the century, a more scientific way of managing society was all the rage. Darwin's evolutionary theory was on the ascent, except that his concept of natural selection was still controversial until the 1940s. Many progressives accepted Darwin's views about common ancestry, but questioned whether the aimlessness of natural selection couldn't be replaced with a purposeful and more efficient social selection. Ascribing to a survival of the fittest model might encourage the survival of the undesirable, since the jungle-like environment of the Gilded Age encouraged vicious traits. Instead, progressives ascribe to a kind of human husbandry, a model of centralized control of human interaction that drew from the wisdom of thousands of years of human imposition on nature through animal breeding. Furthermore, this more scientific approach to human society also appealed, and I'm putting it in quotes, right, because it's pseudoscience. The more scientific approach to human society also appealed to evolutionary theory, phrenology, and crude intelligence testing to rank the racial groups. And of course, it was always Anglo-Saxons at the top and African, people of African descent at the bottom on their charts. Not only would we eliminate dysgenic matches and behaviors, but we would do so along explicitly racist lines. And once again, guys, I kind of can't exaggerate how popular this was at the beginning of the 20th century in the United States academia. It can't be overstated. Only when Hitler's earth-shaking attempt at Aryan mastery arose did the American and English rage for eugenics even begin to subside. The main players in the various eugenics organizations of the day included American presidents, members of their cabinet, heads of various governmental agencies. They were prominent university presidents and economic advisors and heads of state. Economic advisors to heads of state. They were world-famous novelists, playwrights, and poets. As Thomas C. Leonard states in his short but brilliant Illiberal Reformers, in the first 3 decades of the 20th century, eugenic ideas were politically influential, culturally fashionable, and scientifically mainstream. Believe it or not, one of the most prominent tools for eugenic suppression of unwanted populations was the minimum wage. All right, so get ready to bust your brain a little bit, because the way that the progressives were thinking about the minimum wage is very different from the way we think of it today. So it's true that today, many of us think of the minimum wage as something that supports the dignity and well-being of workers. And progressives thought of it that way too. But what's more unfamiliar to us is their praise for its effects on unemployment. While today free marketers argue against the minimum wage because or I should say against a very high minimum wage, because it makes it illegal, or it makes it kind of forces an act of charity to hire people who are not very productive, these earlier progressives actually argued for the minimum wage for the exact same reasons. The willingness of owners to hire whoever was cheapest is just the situation that the progressive economists wanted to avoid by instituting a minimum wage. Immigrants and black people in the new urban centers, already used to a lower standard of living, coming up from the South, more agricultural standard of living, than many, though certainly not all, of their fellow job seekers could underlive whites, and that's the term they used, underlive, and therefore drag down the wages of employees in any profession they entered. Immigrants could be kept out unless they were high earners. Paul Kellogg, the cereal magnate, suggested a $2.50 per day minimum, a wage 50% higher than the average low-skilled worker earned in 1910, basically excluding the black migration or foreign immigration of unskilled workers completely. Leonard explains the logic this way. If the capitalist paid workers a living wage, he could not compete with unscrupulous rivals who hired low-standard women, children, immigrants, blacks, and the feeble-minded, and these are their terms, okay? The concern of the progressives was that to allow such goings-on amounted to race suicide. Instead, the minimum wage could detect inferior workers by making them unemployable, and then force, and this is real, what I'm about to tell you, and then force sterilization or isolation through celibate institutionalization would deal with such persons scientifically. I mean, this was actually the plan that they had in mind. As Woodrow Wilson's Commissioner of Labor, Royal Meeker, put it, better that the state should, quote, support the inefficient wholly and prevent the multiplication of the breed than to subsidize incompetence and unthrift, enabling them to bring forth after their own kind. To bring this conversation up to date, many economists argue that the minimum wage has been a major source of economic inequality between black people and white people. Milton Friedman called it, and this, once again, he's speaking here in the 1950s. Milton Friedman called it the most anti-Negro law on the books, and his predictions about its effects appear to have been borne out in reality. Here is an interview from 1973. Teenage employment is particularly significant for the working class, for whom it often constitutes the bottom rung of the ladder to social mobility, right? The experience you get as a teenager. Okay, this is Friedman. In 1956, I think, the minimum was raised from 75 cents to $1, a very substantial rise. In the early 50s, the unemployment rate among male teenagers was about the same for blacks as for whites. Both were about 8%, when the overall unemployment rate was about 4%. In the late 50s, after the minimum wage rate was raised from 75 cents to $1, the unemployment rate of black teenagers shot up from 8% to something like 20 to 25%. For white teenagers, it shot up to something like 13%. From that day to this, the rates for both black and white teenagers have been higher than before 1956. When they start to decline, a new rise in the minimum wage rate comes along and pushes them up again. The black teenage rate has been very much higher than the white teenage rate for reasons that are highly regrettable and that we ought to be doing something about. And he talks about less schooling and less opportunity to gain skills. Therefore, the minimum wage rate hits them particularly hard. I've often said that the minimum wage rate is the most anti-Negro law on the books. In 2018, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics found that the majority of minimum wage workers are young, single, part-time workers who live in a middle or upper income household. So even if the hope of the minimum or living wage advocate is to lift up those who are trying to support, say, a 4-person family on a minimum wage hourly job, using that particular policy is kind of a sloppy way to do it, right? Because you're capturing all of these well-off people in the same group. So it's not very targeted for the group you're trying to really lift up. It advantages well-off and well-connected teenagers while cutting out those who desperately need on-the-job training that they can acquire in no other way. And the progressivist social engineering continued apace in the early to mid-20th century, but this time not by controlling jobs, but by controlling neighborhoods. The federal government carried out a plan to get more and more white citizens into their own homes. Assuming both that blacks and whites would live more peacefully if kept separate and that the white neighborhoods would retain property values better, the Federal Housing Administration refused to insure integrated neighborhoods. They also refused to insure any homes in all black neighborhoods, also deeming them a bad risk, even though residents were in many cases just as reliably employed as white people. Remember that in the 1950s, the black employment rate was higher than the white employment rate. With black marriage rates nearly equivalent as well at this time to the white marriage rate, the combined income of a black husband and wife may not have been huge, but many were perfectly steady working class households that should have been good bets for banks for a small home. Unfortunately, that was not the case. In 1941, a real estate developer working on an all-black middle-income neighborhood saw his plans crushed when both local banks and the Prudential Life Insurance Company were told by the Federal Housing Administration that they would not approve the mortgages. The banks explicitly agreed to the project. Okay, so the banks were ready to do it, only contingent on FHA approval. It might be impossible to calculate how many financial institutions would have overlooked their own prejudices to finance such creditworthy projects had they not known that the FHA disapproval was inevitable. The subsidization of all white suburbs, along with the exclusion of black and mixed neighborhoods from these subsidies, was intended to relieve the density of the cities and create idyllic all-American neighborhoods. In 1949, Congress passed the American Housing Act, which provided for even more FHA mortgage insurance funding, more public housing, and slum clearance. That last element was referred to as urban redevelopment and later urban renewal, although black Americans referred to it as Negro removal. Pioneers deemed unattractive apartment buildings and ramshackle houses filled with minorities slums, while many, in fact, vital cultural and economic centers for poor but upwardly mobile working class people. James Baldwin told this story in a 1963 interview that is really worth quoting in full. A boy last week, he was 16, in San Francisco, told me on television, thank God we got him to talk. Maybe somebody else ought to listen. He said, I got no country, I got no flag. Maybe he's only 16 years old and I couldn't say you do. I don't have any evidence to prove that he does. They were tearing down his house because San Francisco is engaging, as most northern cities now are engaged in something called urban renewal, which means moving the Negroes out. It means Negro removal. That is what it means. And the federal government is an accomplice to this fact. Now this, we're talking about human beings. There's not such a thing as a monolithic wall or, some abstraction called a Negro problem. These are Negro boys and girls who at 16 and 17 don't believe the country means anything that it says and don't feel they have any place here on the basis of the performance of the entire country. No, am I exaggerating? In 1956, Eisenhower signed the Federal Highway Act into law. Prior to LBJ's Great Society Project, this act accounted for the great non-war expenditure, the greatest in federal funds in American history. Since 90% of the funds for the highway system came from the federal government, it was then open season for city planners to route the highway in order to complete their social engineering goal. Now, whites could commute to work in the city from their spacious suburban homes, and even more slums could be cleared to make room for the highway itself. This time, though, planners wouldn't even be bothered with the legal responsibility to relocate the dispossessed, a responsibility that had often been conveniently ignored in urban renewal programs anyway. Moreover, planners entrenched the segregation between white and black, or out west Latino also, neighborhoods by running the highway in such a way as to permanently divide them. How am I doing on time? 7? Okay, I just want to make sure I might just move through the highway section quickly. But the point that I'm trying to show you here is a series of legal, de jure, right, by law, legal institutions that were really with the attitude of central planning, right? So the idea is sort of the experts know best. We think the races will get along best this way, and so we will engineer this. But how do we ever do social engineering? Well, we have to do it by violating what? People's property rights. Yeah, that's the only way to do it. And so they did. And also, by the way, freedom of contract, right? Notice that the bank and the developers were ready to go on some of those neighborhoods. That's freedom of contract. It was the government who said, no, you're not allowed to do that. Okay. So I won't go into too much detail on the highway system. I could kind of go on and on the highway system. But there's a great book, if you're interested. It's called Folklore of the Freeway by Eric Avila. And he really goes through very specific stories. Miami, Detroit, Nashville. He takes them one by one. And he even shows how, in many cases, there were spots that the highway could have gone through like an industrial part of town. And they purposefully chose the one that would just demolish the black economic centers and then just separate the white from the blacks by a big, huge concrete thing, right? And so you just have a limit there to what can happen organically between people because they're separated physically from one another. And it's interesting how this question of the eminent domain abuse, the takings clause, that you can take someone's property for a public project. It's interesting how it creates odd couples. Okay, so here's an odd couple. Odd Supreme Court couples Sandra Day O'Connor and Clarence Thomas. Wouldn't normally think of them together. They made the exact same claim, actually. They co-authored a decision, or I should say a dissent, from the famous Kelo v. New London case that had to do with eminent domain. Thomas and O'Connor argued that the consequences of today's decision are not difficult to predict and promise to be harmful. So-called urban renewal programs provide some compensation for the properties they take, but no compensation is possible for the subjective value of these lands to the individuals displaced and the indignity inflicted by uprooting them from their homes. Allowing the government to take property solely for public purposes is bad enough, but extending the concept of public purpose to encompass any economically beneficial goal guarantees that these losses will fall disproportionately on poor communities. And this is the sort of like blight, right? So you blight a neighborhood and then you like bring in Walmart. So now it's not even a highway, it's not even a public project, right? It's a private project. These communities are not only systematically less likely to put their lands to the highest and best social use, but are also the least politically powerful. If ever there were justification for intrusive judicial review of constitutional provisions that protect discrete and insular minorities, surely that principle would apply with great force to the powerless groups and individuals the Public Use Clause protects. The deferential standard this court has adopted for the public use clause is therefore deeply perverse. It encourages those citizens with disproportionate influence and power in the political process, including large corporations and development firms, to victimize the weak. So they're pointing out here how having a more stringent commitment to the property rights of every single individual, whether you like what they're doing with their property or not, how important that is. And they weren't alone in their dissent. There were actually 45 states that changed their laws. Everyone was very mad about Kelo v. New London. And the states actually created their own laws to protect against eminent domain abuse. I'm going to go past my little rant on economic impact studies. Let's just say that they're not really true, you know. You know, many of these takings, these applications of the takings clause are for things like stadiums, right? I don't know if you guys have paid attention to these debates in different cities over who's going to pay for the stadium. You know, you have billionaire owners. They want the taxpayers to pay for the stadium. And oftentimes they'll create these economic impact studies. Well, for you econ students, I want you to really look into these economic impact studies, because they're very deceptive. One of the things they do is they pay a lot of attention to all of the money, you know, that will be made for the town. But it doesn't notice that people will, you know, people are going to spend their money on entertainment one way or the other, right? And so this money isn't coming from nowhere. It's coming from somewhere, from the way they would have spent their money otherwise, okay? And so there's a lot of little funky ways that they can kind of puff up the amount of good economic development that things like stadiums bring. Oftentimes a use of blight on neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods. Okay, and I kind of summarized that for you. All right, so if anecdotal cases seem unconvincing from different particular cities, there was a libertarian scholar at the time who compiled mountains of data on urban renewal for a dissertation that turned into a book. His name was Martin Anderson. In 1964, he was an economist. He later served with President Reagan as one of his economic advisors. And it was called The Federal Bulldozer, was the name of the book. And it's interesting because the Boston College Law Review harshly criticized this book at the time, claiming that it was too polemical and wrangling over interpretation of the data. In spite of this, the reviewer, Peter Nash, couldn't help but agree with the most relevant of his critiques of the urban renewal program. In fact, one of Nash's criticisms of Anderson is that he didn't apply all the same critiques of urban renewal to the highway program as well, right? Because, of course, the highway program also used eminent domain abuse. After all, the highway program didn't even require the government to replace the value. Once again, this might be a little too detailed to get into. One of the things, so I wanted to give you kind of two tracks that we're paying attention to here. And let's loop back around to the civil rights movement. But we want to go a little earlier, okay? So we talked about the way that the black church developed, how it led to this huge hike in literacy. Then you see the coming together of black business networks. So I'd start describing all of these obstacles, right? So you have black Americans developing and pursuing their own development. Then you have this pushback, right? And the pushback comes in the form of violations of property rights, freedom of contract, and absolutely of the equal protection of the law. Many times law enforcement was in on some of the abuse that occurred. And if we look at the way that the civil rights movement develops, we actually often miss the fact that the lead up to it, which is, you can think, for instance, of the NAACP, right? So the NAACP is bringing lawsuits to the Supreme Court for various civil rights violations. And who is funding this? Guess who? The black middle and upper class, developed at Hampton Institute by people like Booker T. Washington, right? Madam C.J. Walker, the great hair product millionaire who gave the largest gift the NAACP had ever received. There was a famous doctor named T.R.M. Howard who actually opened hospitals all over the South. He was very rich. And he hosted some of the earliest civil rights meetings. Excuse me, he was kind of a little early to be as famous as some of the later people. But he was the one who, he liked guns, okay? And that was important, because if you were gonna have a civil rights meeting, you needed to just let people know that you were armed, you were gonna protect yourself, okay? So people carried guns. And T.R.M. Howard actually protected the family of Emmett Till. Do you guys know who Emmett Till is? The young boy who was laid out, right? His mother chose to leave it open for people to see how terribly he'd been murdered. And it kind of sparked, in a way, people's consciences. Well, T.R.M. Howard was housing the family under very heavy security at his house during the trial. So he was a mentor to Medgar Evers and many other really important civil rights figures. And these and John H. Johnson, the publisher. So we could go on and on, but the point is that what can get lost, I think, sometimes when we focus simply on the wonderful moral accomplishments of the civil rights movement, is that it never could have happened if it hadn't have been funded by a successful black business class that had been building and building for decades, right? With all of the hard work of the business networks that Washington had created, et cetera. And Washington had to be more subtle because he was in the South. He was in a much more threatening position. So he had to sort of be careful with his words, but he underneath the surface, he was actually doing a lot for civil rights. He was doing it in secret. He was funding it, funding many of these lawsuits in secret. Okay, so the black business, and then, of course, we know the role of the black church in the civil rights movement, right? Which provided the moral framework of nonviolent political action. And much of the social network, too. Think of something like the Montgomery bus boycott. I had a friend who's a project manager. He did a really nice series of articles on the Montgomery bus boycott as like an incredible example of project management, because it was so organized. It was so carefully orchestrated. Imagine what sort of social networks you'd have to have for all of those people to drive each other to work for 381 days. Whoa. That's organized, friends. That's thick social networks. That's thick civil society. And where does that come from? From decades and decades and decades of building up the institution of the black church. And the moral strength that was shown. I'd love for you to go look at the list of things of principles that the protesters were trained in order to be ready to be nonviolent when they would be threatened and harmed, for sure, right, in their protests. So there's a kind of advanced spiritual state that a person has to be in to be able to do that, right? So what I'm telling you is kind of two parallel stories, okay? Now there's so much more we need to talk about, and the rest of it's in my book, which you can pre-order on Amazon.com, and if you're interested. But you can see these two parallel stories, one of black development through civil society and through the market, and the other one with the political pushback, which involves specifically the violation of those very values. These are classical liberal values, right? Property rights, contract rights, equal protection of the rule of law, holding up entrepreneurs, not holding them down, holding them up, right? And empowering entrepreneurs. And so they're pushing through all of these obstacles, okay, in order to achieve that. And now we could go on with the story if we wanted to, but what I liked about, and I'll just stop there, but what I liked about the challenge of speaking to both a lot of economics students, but also students who are at a Christian college, is to just think about how these values underlie the institutions that we need in order to function well, right? And so the black Christians, as they were being converted, understanding their own value as being made in the image of God, and the way that that inspired them to develop themselves and to fight for their own freedom, and specifically for property rights, and right, they wanted farms and they wanted property, and then to get the pushback against those very claims, right, the claims to the basic rights of American citizenship. And so I hope you can see the connection between the principles of our faith and a flourishing economic life. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ferguson. Let me remind our audience here and online both that they can continue to submit questions on slido.com using the code LIBERATION. That's slido.com, code LIBERATION. Our first question is, how were Black women treated when Black men encountered the convict leasing?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm trying to remember if Black men, so Douglas Blackman is the author of the book on convict leasing, which is called Slavery by Another Name. I'm trying to remember if he do you mean like their partners, like the men who were taken?
I think just women in general, because you said...
that it was mostly men.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, you know, Black people in the South were not getting a lot of respect, either gender, but one of the evidences that a lot of the crimes were invented, right, is because they really just needed people to do heavy manual labor. So they were looking to arrest men, right? And so that was part of the fact that it was kind of a trumped up system. I mean, there may have been some minor crimes, but a lot of it wasn't, like I said, it wasn't even crime. I mean, they were just innocent people. And why should, or it was a crime that oughtn't to be a crime, right? Like changing jobs. There was actually an effort at forming a cartel among the farmers. So farmers would they even advertised in the neighborhood, in the newspaper. And they would say, okay, guys, let's all agree together that nobody will underbid anybody else and bring their workers over to their farm. But then cartels are inherently unstable, right? Somebody always went against the deal. And so the point there that I'm making is that the ability to vote with your feet, right? The ability to leave is one way that you bid up your wages, or in this case, your shares. But I don't actually know that Blackman says much about the female experience at that time.
Next, we have a question here about the title of your book. You've made a compelling case for the Black church in thick civil society, but how have African Americans found liberation through markets, as your book title suggests?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the ways was what I hinted at there right at the very end, so that question may have come in before the end. But at the end, I'm pointing out that, if economic power is required in order to wield some political power. Now, I don't mean you need to be a corporation or something, right? You can be a collection of people who have smaller amounts that you're putting together. But you do need some economic power. Things need to be funded. I mean, they needed lawyers, right? The NAACP needed lawyers. You needed lawyers who would go try these cases. You needed to spend the time to find the clients and things like that, to get things to the Supreme Court, to make this happen. So, so that's a really important element there. I also think that Black America, there's a lot I could say about Black America today. 80 to 83% of Black Americans today consider themselves Christian. They call themselves Christian. They're the most likely demographic to believe in God, to pray, to read the Bible in America. And Black Americans today are also extremely entrepreneurial. I will just point out, I'm not trying to be political here, I'm just trying to make a point. When the Sanders versus Biden nomination got to South Carolina, where it was really the Black vote that was going to determine what happened, Biden won, right? I mean, in other words, there wasn't a lot of excitement about democratic socialism among the Black community. I think there's a lot of excitement about entrepreneurship and Black ownership. I see a lot of that in the Black community. So I think that's just partially cultural. That's something that is valued in that community. There's even a church, I think this is actually not uncommon. There's a church in St. Louis called Advancing Church, which actually has courses on entrepreneurship. They churn out Black business owners. That's part of building the community. And then the other thing that I discussed in the book is something called neighborhood stabilization. If you've ever heard of Bob Lupton, he wrote a book called Toxic Charity, or Brian Fickert wrote a book called When Helping Hurts. There's sort of critique of the way we do philanthropy. And the critique is, you really undermine a person's dignity if you just sort of hand them something, because you don't treat them like they have anything to offer you in exchange, right? And that can be demeaning, and it's also not helping to build the local economy, right? And so what many of these, I call them the prophets of neighborhood stabilization, John Perkins and the CCDA and Bob Woodson and many others, what they're saying is, no, the way that you're going to raise up communities that are heavily destabilized is through business, through building business, right? Because you have to build wealth. So if we're going to complain, for instance, about the wealth gap, you have to build wealth. You don't build wealth by transfer payments, you build wealth by starting businesses. That's how you build wealth. So got an amen over there. So I think that philosophy is actually quite popular, both in the Black community, and it's becoming extremely popular in the philanthropy community. So for instance, if you go into a nonprofit administration program, they're all going to know who Brian Fickert and Bob Lupton and John Perkins, they're going to, that's going to be the text that they use in their courses in many cases. Because philanthropy that undermines long-term growth is not really helping, right? Yeah.
So I'm going to exercise questioner prerogative and combine two questions, if that's okay, both looking to make these things up to the current moment. Do you believe racism is still alive in our day and age? If so, where is it the most evident? And how does your talk conflict or agree with critical race theory?
Just a tiny question. It's like huge. Okay. What do I want to say? Of course, racism is still an issue today. Where is it most prevalent? Boy, that's an interesting question. I will say this. Let's make it interesting, right? Why be boring? I'm going to leave and never see you guys again, so who cares? No, I'm kidding. But I'll say this. I do think that we are making a mistake in our discussions about racism sometimes, because we know that racism is at the root of inequalities that exist today. And so we think that by fixing racism, like say through trainings or something, is going to fix the inequalities. And why? I'll tell you why I don't agree with that. Because they're right that racism is at the root, right? We go back and we see the neighborhoods being destroyed and people being scattered to the four winds, and how can you rebuild your networks when that's done to you? Okay, that's right. That's a major cause. But that causes something else, which causes something else, which causes something else, which causes us to be here where we are today. See what I'm saying? And you have all kinds of things in between, including mass incarceration and family breakdown and neighborhood destabilization and all kinds of things. So is sending people to trainings, and I have a little bit of a chip on my shoulder because the studies are very consistent on a lot of these trainings, implicit bias and diversity trainings and stuff. And I think you can do effective ones, but a lot of them are not effective. And it's actually very consistently shown. And so what's the point? The point is we need to make a distinction. This is the way I put it. We need to make a distinction between proximate causes and non-proximate causes. So racism is in the chain of causation, but it's a non-proximate cause. It's 5 steps back. And we actually need something for the proximate cause, right? And so we may need mentors for dads, and we may need people to get re-entering citizens into jobs, right? And we may need, when I talk about neighborhood stabilization, I mean hyper-local, block by block, motivated by love, personal presence, 8 to 10 years of commitment, neighborhood renewal. That's what we need, because that's what works, right? That's what really works.
How important is it to maintain Christian values as the basis of fighting for Black liberation?
Well, one of the reasons I'd like to maintain Christian values as the basis for fighting for Black liberation is because Black people are mostly Christian. I mean, when 80 to 83% of this minority population is Christian, calls themselves Christian, believes in God, prays, reads the Bible more than white people do. Even the millennials, black millennials or black Gen Zs, still more likely to pray and things like that. You can look at Pew Research if you're interested in those numbers, Pew Research. And so that's number one, is I'd like to respect the integrity of that community, draw upon the things that matter to them. And I guess that's where I didn't answer the CRT question, and that's too complicated, but I will say this, that's a little bit where I would majorly depart from CRT, right? Because there's a sense that there's a foreign philosophy being brought in and imposed on a community. It's not organic to that community. Maybe an insight here or there is compatible, but the core concept is not necessarily compatible. So, now there are people who say that it is, right? So you can look at those people, but I don't think so. And so that's part of it, is just respecting the integrity of the black community. But the other part of it is, I actually believe in the Imago Dei. I believe that every individual is made in the image of God. I think that you should have the ability to be free, right? And you should be able to own things and innovate and make things and not be stopped at every turn. It makes me really mad that we tell African hair braiders that they have to go to 2 years of cosmetology school and spend $20,000 just so they can braid people's hair in their basement, which they're not going to be able to do any better after all of that than they could before, right? All that is established salon owners getting in the way of startups. That's all that is. It's cronyism. It's entrenched businesses stopping people from succeeding. And so what I'm looking at there is people crushing the poor. That's what that looks like to me, right? And go read Amos. We're not supposed to be crushing the poor, okay? And so opening up all of these opportunities by getting out of people's way would be good.
What is the best way to encourage civil society in our communities?
These questions are so deep. What is the best way to encourage civil society in our communities? Mentorship? Mentorship, I think. I mean, this is off the top of my head, y'all, because that's a big question. But at the core of civil society is mentorship. It's one person taking another person under their wing. That's a lot of what happened. I didn't even get to talk about the black fraternal societies, guys. This was a big deal in the early 20th century. Half of black men were in black fraternal societies. Well, those were great because they were a kind of insurance. But the other reason that they were great was because you knew people and they could help you. Oh, you're starting a business here. Let me show you the ropes. Man, I trust you. I know you're going to do a good job. I'm going to give you a no-interest loan. That stuff happens organically if you're in societies where you're together, right? But if you're not, if you're isolated, it can't happen. I mean, that's the issue with sort of the way that the highways were set up and the ghettoization of people, both black and Latino, in different parts of the country, is that it isolates people from their social networks. So if you are unemployed and a lot of the people around you are unemployed, then you're going to have a lot more trouble finding a job than someone who's surrounded by people who are employed. How did you guys get your first job? Wasn't it probably from somebody who recommended you to something? Have you guys had jobs? Just making sure. You know, I worked at a roast beef place when I was 16. My friend Jeremy said, hey, they pay $8 an hour, you should come over here. And so I did, you know, and that's how I got started. So we take for granted that we have all these networks, right? And imagine being isolated and having no one to ask, hey, where should I go get a job? Right? And so I think we're going to have to be intentional to cross those boundaries and maybe even break them down. I mean, there are actually highways being removed from cities now and being turned into green space and stuff. So some of this stuff, we're just undoing it. We're spending all this energy to undo it. Mixed use areas. You know what I'm talking about? Mixed use, where you've got the restaurants and then the lofts above and then the movie theater. That's how everything was at the beginning of the 20th century. And then we decided to introduce zoning, right? Residential zoning and industrial zoning, which basically just meant we'll put single-family people here because we don't want apartment buildings with a bunch of people in one place, because who goes there? Poor people who need high-density housing, right? And so, yeah, I think you getting a mentor and you being a mentor is the beginning, but we have to find the organizations that already exist and empower them. We probably don't need any more nonprofits. There are so many nonprofits. Find the ones that are not doing toxic charity. Find the ones that are doing it right and just support them with everything you've got. And a lot of that's mentoring. That's what, I'm on the board of Love the Lou in St. Louis. That's what they need. They need mentors for inner city entrepreneurs. They need mentors for kids. They need mentors for dads. They need mentors for moms. I mean, that's a lot of what it is. Yeah.
We have another big one, I think.
What can killing me.
What can we do today to make up for the unjust economic gap between slave descendants and white society?
Yeah, that's a big question. You know, that is such a big question. I think the mindset, once again, guys, when I'm using the term progressive here, I'm using it in the technical sense, the progressive movement at the turn of the century. It was a scientistic mindset. We can plan. And I think we have, in a way, absorbed the progressive mindset, the scientistic mindset, because we think that there's some set of policies, it's kind of like a push-button thing, that there's some set of policies that we can just kind of snap our fingers and make it happen. And it's a sad truth that the state can cause problems that it cannot fix. Now, there are policies that I recommend in the book. I discuss criminal justice reform. I discuss educational freedom. I discuss economic freedom. Okay, those are policies. I'm not a big fan of the drug war. Don't tell anybody I said that. Okay, so that's part of criminal justice reform. But then I flip over to neighborhood stabilization because you have to have the positive side that's rebuilding what was lost. And you can't do that in a faceless way. The state has to be faceless. It just has to, right? It has to treat everybody the same. It has to be a faceless entity. It can't be like in your life, walking through life with you. Like, that's just not what governments do, right? But yet, that's what people need. You need to walk through life with people, and that's neighborhood stabilization. So that's not gonna be a policy fix. Now, if you wanna discuss reparations, I do have an article that just came out on acton.org discussing a classical liberal approach to reparations, which is like probably totally different from anything you've heard before. So definitely check it out. And I just recorded a podcast with Kira Davis. It's called Just List JLTY is her podcast. Kira Davis, where we discuss that article for an hour. So if you want to hear me talk about that, you can. But I do think that something like low-interest business loans that are funded by the sale of federal lands would be totally justifiable. I actually don't see why not. It's the state that committed the sins, so it should be their assets, not current taxpayer money, right? Assets that are sold off. I don't know if you guys realize, but the federal government owns $2 trillion in American land. It's like a third of the United States. It's crazy. They own a lot of stuff. Okay, so we wouldn't fund it through transfer payments because I understand the arguments about the injustice of that. It would be actual federal assets, and then what do you want to do? You want to rebuild what has been lost by empowering people economically. So you want to encourage economic growth, not a new park or people talk about stuff like this. Let's have parks. We need businesses, guys. Right? We need businesses so people can have jobs, so people can build wealth. That's how it works, okay? And so I think something like that would be justifiable. Do I think it would, work? I don't know. I have way more confidence in neighborhood stabilization. And I say that because Bob Lupton and Lucas Rugley in St. Louis have done it. They've done it. You can go to the neighborhood and look at it. And I can introduce you to all the kids who have jobs and are going to college, and they're not in jail, and they're not in a gang. I can introduce you to them.
How has the church, I think they mean the broader church, how has the church failed to support Black liberation?
Can I say one thing? I need to amend something here, guys. I'm usually always careful to say this. I'm going to say this. 80% of Black people do not live below the poverty line. I hate that. I hate the equivalence of Black and poor. That's just not true. The majority of Black Americans consider themselves middle class. So why am I talking about these destabilized neighborhoods? Because that's where you see the really sticky poverty, right? So I just wanted to make that clear. Many black people are doing very, very well. Repeat the question, please.
How has the church failed to support black liberation?
This hurts my heart a little bit, a lot. Look, guys, my dad was a white evangelical pastor. Okay, now I did grow up in a multi-ethnic church, but we were white evangelicals, I mean, theologically. We didn't really appreciate the black church. We did a little bit, but not a lot. Like, we didn't really get the theology, the emphasis on creation. This is a weakness in evangelical theology. Start with sin, end with redemption, when actually the story starts with creation and ends with restoration. Black people got it all by themselves, right? They got it. They just read the Bible and saw it there, and the emphasis on the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. Now, we can argue about how best to help those people, but that is absolutely what we need to be doing. The contribution of the black church has not been properly appreciated and acknowledged by the white church, the white evangelical church. I can't speak for mainline, and you know what I mean? I don't want to speak outside my knowledge. But I really believe that. And I believe that a lot of racial reconciliation in the church is really just about Christian believers learning a heck of a lot more about each other than they have known. Because it kind of once you start learning, you're like, oh my gosh, this is beautiful. It's really, really wonderful. There's a great book I highly recommend called Reading While Black by Esau McCulley, where he talks about the theology of the black church, which is a little hard to discover because this is another sad thing. The more conservative seminaries didn't let black people in. So where did black people go? The more progressive seminaries. So when you read James Cone, who has lots of interesting things to say, but James Cone wouldn't even be allowed to preach in a lot of black churches. I mean, he's just very, very progressive. He's not quite orthodox, in some of his views. Definitely worth reading. I don't mean he's not. But my point is that you actually have to go back to like sermons and newsletters and magazines, in the black church to find what, the majority of black Christian believers were actually saying. And one of the things they were saying is that some of the issues that the white church was having between like the modernist fundamentalist debates and stuff, the black church was like, what are y'all talking about? I mean, they just, it was almost embarrassing to them. I mean, there were a lot of things that their very high view of scripture, but with a broad interpretation, really could solve, And so seeing the black church as a resource would be numero uno in my mind.
So we only have about 4 minutes left, so this will probably be our last question. But a couple people are asking this. What is the main takeaway for us Hope students? What do you want us to remember?
The main takeaway, and certainly from my book, well, let me say from my book. The main takeaway from my book is that a classical liberal appreciation of property rights, contract rights, economic protection, equal protection, the rule of law, appreciation for markets, is actually a really helpful lens for understanding black history. It highlights a lot. It brings your attention to a lot. And that's not always understood. People don't think, oh, classical liberals, they're the ones to ask, So that's the big takeaway from the book. The takeaway from this presentation, I hope, is to see the connection between the ethical and moral commitments that come with our faith and the way that grounds a flourishing economy because of the way we respect the individual and their freedom.
All right. Well, thank you for your thought-provoking lecture and answering our big questions. Would you all please join me in thanking Dr. Ferguson?
Thank you, guys, and I'll hang out up here if anybody wants to talk more.
Have a good night, everyone.